Snow Treasure by Marie McSwigan, Chapter 28. There he goes! After him! Peter had little chance to escape. Lieutenant Sit-Down and almost his whole company were chasing him. But Peter knew these woods and the foreigners did not. He hoped to cross the Snake above where it was narrower and take the ski trail up the mountain. In the forest above he had a good chance to hide. But he was cut off before he could get upstream, far enough to cross. The Germans spread out in a circle and blocked all points. Peter felt like a rabbit facing a pack of hounds. Rough arms were around him and he fell to the ground. There was a tussle, and Peter all but succeeded in throwing off his captors. But the others came up and he was one against many, a boy surrounded by men. There was nothing to do but submit. They dragged him to his feet. He fell in step with them. They were marching him off to their barracks. But the snowball trick had worked. He had succeeded in distracting the commandant. The outrage of being snowballed by a Norwegian boy was enough to make him forget the lesson he was giving Lovisa, showing her how the Norse would be treated by the German conquerors. And so he had not uncovered the gold she had buried beneath the very snowman he was kicking. Yes, the snowball trick had worked. When Peter was led back to the place between the two fallen trees, he saw the commandant was leaving. The snowmen were still standing and the children were filing out of the Snake. Peter did not mind being a German prisoner if he had saved the gold. How much of this had Uncle Victor seen, he wondered. No doubt every bit of it. But could he do anything to help him? Frightened as he was, not knowing what was going to happen, he still didn't want any aid from Uncle Victor. His uncle's only concern was to get the gold out of Norway. If he did that, it was all that anyone could expect of him. But Uncle Victor wasn't the one to let a fellow down, Peter knew. He had always been ready to help before. But in a case like this, with so much, the money, maybe their very lives involved, Peter didn't think his uncle could do much. A soldier marched on his right and one on his left, and hidden behind were others. When they reached the sentries, these sprang up, their rifles on their shoulders. So they were quite a little company when they turned into the barracks they had built before the fishing wharf. The heavy boots of the Nazis clumped in rhythm over the wooden boards of the barracks floor. Thump, thump, thump. Down a long hallway they pounded. Then they stopped. Peter was shoved into a box of a room, no bigger than a clothes closet. A key was turned in the door. Then the thump, thump, thump of the soldiers as they left him alone in the twilight. He stumbled against something like a low shelf. It was supposed to be his bed, he guessed. There was a window at one end of the tiny room. It was barred. Through it he could see the beach, snow-covered to the very edge of the black lapping water. Through the snow the sentry stepped, up and down, his legs swinging straight out from his hips like those of a toy soldier wound with a key. What were they going to do with him, Peter wondered. Would he be tried at a court-martial? Up past the window stepped the sentry. Then he turned and followed his own footprints back in the direction he had come. Was it a serious offense to snowball a high German officer? Peter believed it was. It had something to do with order and respect for authority. Well, he didn't care how serious it was. They could shoot him if they liked. He was glad he had thrown that snowball. But still, he was horribly afraid. Would even the Germans put a boy to death? He couldn't be sure. From the stories of what they did in Poland, he could believe almost anything. Still, these Germans in Norway didn't seem so bad. The captain, who had gone away, had moved his troops out of their sled track, and they had all been very decent and had kept to themselves and had not even raided the food supplies, as they had done in other countries. They had all been very friendly, except this commandant. But even he had offered to have an orderly help Mrs. Lundstrom pull the sled on which Bunny and the others sat on thousands of kroners of gold. But Jan's story of Poland kept coming back, of how they had turned the people out of their houses and had taken the priest off the altar at Mass. When he thought of Jan, his mouth was hot and dry again, for whether or not he was in serious trouble for having snowballed the commandant, he knew he would be if it were known he'd seen the escaped Pole. Lovisa said there was a notice on the school door saying that anyone who was found to know something about him and not telling would be punished by death. By death. How cold it was in this barrack. Even in his winter breaker and heavy outdoor clothes, he felt cold. His teeth were coming together and apart like hammers. The sun had gone down and there was only a dim gray light coming from the inside. It seemed to be raining. Maybe that was why it got dark so early. Anyway, the northern afternoon was over. Outside it all seemed so wet and sad, down here by the fishing pier. After a time, the soldier came to the door. He brought Peter a deep dish of stew and some dark bread. The soldier spoke to him. "I come back to get your dish. Then I will take you to the commandant," he said in German. Peter couldn't eat. He tried to, but it was no use. Later there were footsteps in the hall. A key turned in the lock. The time was up. The soldier had come to take him to the commandant. He stepped into the cell. Even in the dim light, Peter could tell it was not the same soldier.